As Naya said, my name's Jennifer Holme. I use she, her pronouns, and it's a true honor to be here and part of this conversation, this incredibly important conversation. And I just want to thank Naya and Andrew and New York and Texas Appleseed and their partners for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. My talk today is going to be building on the context that Naya and Andrew had laid out. And it kind of provides a bit of a high-level 30,000-foot view of a framework that my co-author of a book that I wrote, and Kara Finnegan and I wrote. We think it's a promising framework, and I think it'll really complement the voices that you're going to hear after my presentation on sort of some of the community-based strategies as well. So if we can go to the next slide. Today's talk is really going to be based off the book that Naya had referenced that I wrote with my co-author Kara. And so my talk is going to be divided into two parts. One is sort of thinking about understanding our approach really entails understanding how this approach is different than a lot of the traditional ed policy approaches currently to addressing educational inequality. So we're going to I'll briefly go through some of the problems with the current predominant approaches, and then lay out this regional framework, which we think offers a very promising, admittedly aspirational way of looking at these issues and addressing the underlying causes of inequality rather than the symptoms, which we argue many policies are only focused on the symptoms rather than the causes. So if we can go forward. We argue in our book and thinking about this framework that existing policy approaches tend to fail to address these underlying root causes of educational inequality. And one of the reasons for this is that they are sort of driven by flawed assumptions or theories about what the source of the problem is. And so oftentimes assumptions and theories that are driving education policies are incomplete or at worst misguided and can make the problem worse. I'm going to kind of go through a couple of common definitions or assumptions around the causes of educational inequality and kind of lay out our thinking around some of these ways of defining the problem and the solutions that follow. So one way of defining the problem, as we all know, is that educational inequality is the result of a lack of sort of standards and accountability, maybe a lack of focused effort or enough talent by educators in the system. So under this framing of educational inequality, the problem of educational inequality, the focus is really on change within the system and tinkering within the system. You can go forward. So the solution is to improve incentives or sanctions or change governance structures. And so there's sort of a menu here of things that we often try in the ed policy sphere to kind of deal with this problem of educational inequality, including a number of things like market competition or standards and accountability. You can go forward. But the research results are that the results of these are very mixed. It largely depends on implementation, can be very hard to scale up. And the biggest issue is that it leaves these underlying structural inequalities that Naya and Andrew had described completely unaddressed. So you leave these segregated communities and inequities around tax base, health, employment, and housing untapped. And this map on the right, I think, is a really powerful illustration of the limitations of some of these approaches. It's a map of Milwaukee's school district boundaries, and you can see the high level of concentration of poverty in the census tracts within those district boundaries. And the blue dots are schools that are identified by the state as failing. And so even under a system of standards and testing and accountability, where are all the quote unquote failing schools in this system or schools that are struggling as defined by testing and accountability, which are very limited measures in terms of understanding schools. But they're all concentrated, not coincidentally, within Milwaukee, which has a long history of structural racism causing these problems. So another way we think of the problem of educational inequality is that there's a lack of investment in neighborhoods that have caused a decline in access or reduced access to resources, a lack of targeting of resources. And so a solution here is place-based strategies, which we do think are very promising, but they are not alone enough. And so we can go to the next slide. So we have the solution around improved health and social services, stabilizing, revitalizing neighborhoods, One famous example, of course, is the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. And the focus is saturating communities with resources and strategic investments. And while we think they're promising, these two have their limits. And so if you can go to the next slide, alone, they have their limits. So the results in the research is that there are some gains, but it's challenging to scale and then sustain financially. And again, it too does these community-based investment and community development strategies, while they're one important piece of the puzzle, it doesn't get at the underlying systems driving the inequality in the first place. And so as Patrick Sharkey has written in his book, Stuck in Place, policies that target resources towards specific places, if implemented, are unlikely to have broad impacts that will reduce racial inequality on their own. So they are one component, but they are not sufficient to address these problems. If we can go to the next slide. And then another piece of the way of defining the problem, which is something that is near and dear to this conversation, is thinking about educational inequality being a cause, school segregation as being a problem of educational inequality. And so the solution, of course, is school integration within or between districts. And we think, of course, this is a very promising approach and something that's really critically important. But we think it needs also to be one part of a broader strategy. So the research results, of course, are extremely positive on school and the benefits of school integration, especially over the long term on families and children's lives for their children and grandchildren, as Rucker Johnson's research has shown. But if we can go to the next slide. And what we write about in our book is we studied, our book is based on our study of interdistrict desegregation programs, which promote integration across school district boundary lines between cities and suburbs. And so we actually studied each of these programs in our research and wrote about them in our book. So we think that they are important models for hope within this space. But we did find they ran up against a lot of challenges. And if we can go to the next slide. Our study showed that they had a lot of challenges because these were sort of programs operating kind of in isolation and sort of facing these forces on their own. So there's lots of tension around the purposes of this plan. And there was political tensions, oftentimes lack of supports for students of color in white settings. And these plans were very politically tenuous. As well. So while we think they are a great reason for optimism and deserve all of our support, they need more support. They need broader systems around them to support the causes and address the underlying causes of inequality. So we can keep going. So to sort of summing up this first part of my presentation, so the ways that we define the problem of educational inequality and so many prominent approaches do have promise, but they have some limits. So they're either limited in sustainability or fraught with tension politically or operating in isolation on their own without a lot of other political support. And in some cases, in the case I'd argue of standards and accountability and market-based reforms can make the problems worse. And our bigger argument is that it's really failing to address these underlying systems that drive inequality in the first place. So we really need to tackle those drivers of inequality that sustain inequity structurally that we need to get at. So we need to get that big iceberg underneath the water here in this picture. And we need to see and recognize that. So I'll kind of go on to the next part of my talk, which is thinking about this alternative framework that we call a regional framework to address inequality. And I'll talk a little bit about how it relates to integration initiatives. So a deeper but overlooked cause, we argue, is this issue of fragmentation. We call it fragmentation and segregation within metropolitan areas. And fragmentation is the existence of numerous separate municipalities and school districts within a metropolitan area. And I'll show some examples in New York and in Texas shortly. But they're results of policy decisions that have happened over decades. The first is the policies that Naya and Andrew had described, federal government policies around redlining, subsidizing the movement of white families to suburbs, denial of those opportunities for people of color, and exclusion of them from those wealth building opportunities. And at the same time, these policies, of course, fueled disinvestment in urban cores. And then a second piece of this is that state laws then allowed, once white families were given money to move out of urban cores, the states then allowed them to wall themselves off into separate cities and school districts, creating their own municipalities and their own school systems. And so what you end up with is, this is a map on the right of the St. Louis metropolitan area, dozens and dozens of cities and school systems surrounding an urban core, which perpetuates the mere existence of all of these municipalities that are separate and distinct, are a ongoing source of segregation and resource inequality. And I'll talk about how that is in my next slide. So what happens is, when you have many school systems or many cities in a metropolitan area, it creates, and when they're segregated and economically unequal, it creates a competition between them for tax spaces and resources and businesses. And so what ends up happening is that in these competitions, affluent suburbs use the tools that are available to them, like land use and taxation policies, to exclude low-income families, zone out low-income housing, and zone in affluent families by setting minimum lot size requirements and minimum house size requirements. And the benefits of these tools is they're able to keep their cost burdens low, their tax base high, and their tax rates low. So they have low tax rates and abundant resources with which to serve their residents. But lower income communities that have been created due to the structural racism, they start with a low tax base, and then they have a hard time luring families and businesses to their community that have resources. So they oftentimes have to tax themselves at very high rates to yield very low revenue. And so it's hard to work with that math. As Myron Orfield says, it's hard to really lure people there, saying, come here, we'll tax you at a really high rate and you're going to get few services. And so as a result, these communities tend to have a disproportionate amount of low-income housing due to a lot of state policy that Andrew had referenced, many residents with needs and few tax resources with which to meet them. And so this ends up creating a cycle. If we can kind of go to the next slide, which is, and this is an example, sorry, of fragmentation. This is Rochester, New York. So you can see these numerous school district boundaries around this core city of Rochester. So the city and school district boundary lines are mostly the same. And there's numerous school districts within the Rochester metro area. And you can see where the poverty is concentrated in one in the city of Rochester. And then we'll go to the next slide. Looking at Texas, we have kind of an unusual situation where on the left, it shows the city limits of San Antonio. The city limits are actually very large and covers almost the entire metro area of San Antonio. So you can see that gray on the left. And then on the right, you can see that there's actually numerous school districts, though, carved out within the San Antonio metropolitan area. So that's an example of highly fragmented set of school districts, but the city itself is large. So it's slightly different and kind of unique. I'm happy to answer questions about that at some point. But if we can keep going here. So what we argue in the book is that this fragmentation and the competition between these different unequal communities just has a self-perpetuating cycle of segregation and inequality built in it that generates and perpetuates inequality. So if you have segregated communities with low tax bases, they have to impose high tax rates to provide services, driving other people to choose other places to live. Middle-class families and businesses tend to choose other communities with lower tax rates and better services. And the cycle continues almost without anyone needing to do anything. It's all the policies that weave together. So we argue that this is, if we can go to the next slide, that this is then, if we define the problem as this fragmentation and competition across regions, then you need a regional approach to address this problem. So we need to tackle these the segregation patterns and these competitive relationships. And we need, again, like I mentioned, this idea of a regional approach beyond one school district to cover multiple school districts and communities to address inequality. And so if we can go to the next slide. So the regional approaches, John Powell talks about this, how it shifts the framework for policymaking. So it's a way to reconceptualize metropolitan areas for the common good of all residents, affluent or not. Instead of calling upon each locality to take responsibility only for itself, regionalism recognizes the entire area as a system of interdependent parts. The whole will prosper only if all parts are able to function. So it's this idea of of including everyone in the entire metropolitan area as part of one community and designing policies in that way. There are two examples. We talk about a few in our book, but in education, there's sort of one example that has existed. Regrettably, it has been chipped away over time politically in the state of Nebraska, but it sort of represented the one and only real example of this in education that was enacted. And so I'll kind of walk through that really quickly. So it was called the Learning Community of Douglas and Sarpy Counties, created in 2007 after years of conflict between the Omaha School District, the Central City District, and the suburbs around resources and segregation. The policy solution that came up there was some dispute around school district boundaries. The solution left boundaries intact, but created a regional solution to address inequalities across the metro area in both resources, tax base, and school segregation. And so the unit that was created, again, was called the Learning Community. It's since been modified, and regrettably, a lot of the more promising elements have been chipped away due to political forces. But I think we think it represents sort of a really promising vision around what could happen in regional solutions in education and to address segregation. And there's 4 components to this. One is, these are components that we argue are needed in a regional framework. The first is regional governance. And so what they had is a 21-member governing board called the Learning Community Coordinating Council that was elected in a general election. Like when you go to a general election, you elect members to this council from across the entire metropolitan area. And the 11 superintendents did play an advisory role. If we can keep going. And so this is where it just shows all the different school districts in different colors, and then the election districts for the coordinating council. And we'll keep going. Component 2, we argue that's important for a regional framework, is tax-based sharing across communities. And so it did have a tax-based sharing plan to pool and then distribute school finance resources back to communities based on need. So high wealth and low wealth tax resources were pooled and then redistributed. And then there was an extra levy across the whole region to fund magnet schools and also investments in elementary learning centers. So it really equalized resources, and in theory would reduce the competitive competition between localities. So there's some theory around how it can create more equity as well. It can interrupt the processes driving inequality. The third component is sort of related to those in-place investments I talked about earlier. So they had funneled resources into communities that had high poverty and were historically marginalized, and created these elementary learning centers. So they levied a tax across all 11 districts and then funneled money into these particular highest poverty communities in the Omaha metro area. So there were sort of these in-place investments that we think are important. And then lastly, component 4 was thinking about integration across school district boundary lines. And so they created an integration program. This was by socioeconomic status, but it was a way of trying to ensure that students had access across school districts in the metro area. And then they also had interdistrict magnet schools that were an option to be created as well. So we think that these solutions are promising in that they attack systems of competition, they reduce barriers resulting from school district boundaries for students, they target investments, and then they require attentiveness to these regional inequities through governance and resources. And so in summary, this is sort of a recap of what we argue for in a regional equity framework. There's both with schools and with broader communities. There's a need for tax-based sharing, mobility policies, both in schools and housing, allowing children and their families to move freely across for the purposes of integration across boundary lines. In-place investment, so for both educational programs and community development, and then governance, regional governance. So this idea that all voices across a region are represented, and also critically important is coordination across sectors, so that it shouldn't be an education initiative alone or a housing initiative alone or transit. All of those sectors ideally need to be brought into the conversation. So just thinking, my last slide here is thinking about what you can do in your space. Bringing stakeholders to a common table, inviting folks from different parts of a metropolitan area together, and different stakeholders to come and start discussing the problems. Thinking about reframing the problem as a regional problem rather than an urban problem or an issue that's only limited in scope to one particular geographic area. I think helping reframe the problem as a regional equity issue, and that regional inequality is a driver of all of these problems is really important. Um, Another important strategy, that's something that we borrowed from Myron Orfield, is thinking about this coalition amongst municipalities with common interests. So oftentimes we have inner ring suburbs and urban cores that might have really common interests aligned and can build coalitions in ways that they may not otherwise notice or see. And that can be a potential for political mobilization. And then advocating for cross-sector conversations, bringing people, instead of we tend to stay in our lane in education or housing, and that's not true of the work that Appleseed does. Appleseed's a really good example of bringing people across sectors together, but we argue for that as well. And the next slide. And that's all. I think that's it for me, but thank you so much for letting me be a part of this conversation and presenting our framework.